So welcome to CyFy. I'm excited to have you here. I'm closer to retirement, so I'm not going to be doing the talking here. I'm going to be posing a few questions to the rest of the panel this morning on some of the key issues that engage all of us around the world. But before that, I'm happy for two reasons. I'm happy because last year there was a demand that we see a much larger number of voices out of Africa present in this program, and I think we have tried to do that this time. We see a much larger number of representation from that continent, and that is going to be the place where we are going to find resolution to many of the questions that engage humanity in this century. So I think I'm happy for that reason. More African voices, more African keynotes, more African young voices, and we've tried to do that this year at CyFy. The second was that last year we had a dismal ratio of men is to women speakers. And this year, the numbers in the last count after all the dropouts and last minute pullouts is 65 men to around 38 women. It's not ideal, but it is nearly 25% more than last time. We need that number to be at par, and hopefully next year we will get there. And of course, the average age of the speakers has fallen dramatically. So I think that's something also that we need to commend ourselves on. But having said that, let me begin this morning's conversation. We have 28 minutes to get 5 views. Let me start with Sean Kanuck, who has now, Sean, congratulations, you are now a father. So you can now really look at the big trends going ahead. And let me pose that first big question to you. What are the key trends that will define digital politics, security, and indeed governance of this medium? And to what extent will cyber and the digital and technology sector now be the new theater and tool for state operations, influence, aggression, and perhaps interference?
Thank you very much. I'm going to address both of those questions, but not necessarily directly, but in some opening thoughts here. And while we shift the initiative and the structure of CyFy beyond just a cyber conference, I thought back 5 years ago to when Samir and I were first discussing having a global cyber conference in India, and thinking back to before multi-stakeholderism had been adopted nearly universally, before the ICANN transition, before the GGE had succeeded twice and possibly now run its course, and before we had entered the world of political influence operations 2.0, I think in the last year. Very excited that about a year ago, Samir and I were talking, and we said, what does the future look like? What does CyFy need to look like? And I think we agreed it's getting beyond looking at cyber as an independent discipline, because it's capturing and changing and a part of every single thing we're doing in our lives. And for me, it's about the nexus between information technology, biotechnology, and nanotechnology. So much of our world is being reduced to information science. We are now programming and coding in carbon-based DNA instead of just in silica. We are able to print in material science at the molecular level and possibly undermine or enhance the integrity of inorganics at that basic level. We haven't seen these kind of changes, certainly not in the bio sense, in over 100,000 years when we last got the ability to change the human organism by capturing and being able to control fire. And we changed our own bodies by cooking our food. I know I'm getting philosophical on you here, but to get back to the two questions that Samir asked, how is this going to transform? And the answer is, in every way possible and in ways more accelerated than we can even predict right now. And what does it mean for conflict, aggression, and war? And I come from the hard security studies. My answer is, I think it's changing how you engage in conflict. If you can undermine things at the most basal level, if you can attack a society without attacking a military, Are we at a point where we're making the world safer for soldiers and more dangerous for civilians? That's one of my concerns as a lawyer. This passive aggression of how you conduct international politics, or how we're conducting it at a domestic level in my country and in some others. I see these as challenges at a social and societal level rather than in a technical level. So I'm incredibly excited to be a part of this advanced dialogue that's getting us out of the stovepipe of talking about a technical cyber conference. I'm thrilled that we've expanded the diversity and intend to increase it. And I'm very excited about the New Voices program we have this year, where we have actively encouraged and invited new thinkers and individuals who may not have presented at as many international conferences as some of the balding white men like myself have in the past. And I think it will reinvigorate this effort, and I think it will keep India as a focal point of relevant discussions about technology, human life, and the potential for overcoming global challenges. I look forward to the next 2 days with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Arun, that leads us to you. India. Is India at the table or on the menu in cyber politics? And is India a good story to emulate, or are we just good storytellers about an ideal that is increasingly difficult to realize? Who are we and what do we want?
Well, I think American and Chinese companies are carving up the Indian digital economy. So I guess the short answer is, for now, we are on the table. The question is how tasteful we want to be to those people who want to consume us. But I think on the whole, I think the Indian digital story is by and large positive, as we saw in conversations yesterday on both the parallel dinner conversations that we've had to open the conference, and in the many sessions that lie ahead. One common theme will be that governments across the world are taking back the internet, and this includes governments and jurisdictions with as opposed views as, say, a European Union or a China. So you can see that the regulator in these places is taking back what they believe to be in the best interest of the industry or the consumer or the government itself. But in India, this is probably the only jurisdiction where you can see both, of course, attempts by the state and the regulator to take back the internet in ways that they perceive in their infinite wisdom, but also a bottom-up movement. There is, and I'm sure many of you would know that the Supreme Court of India recently came out with a judgment, enshrining a fundamental right to privacy, whatever that means. But you're also seeing some technological developments, starting with things like the India stack, engineering architecture that is meant to address the bottom of the pyramid, that is scalable, that is low cost, that is just not happening in any other part of the world. In Europe, for instance, local competitors are being decimated for whatever reason. In the United States, let's not even go there. China is the only jurisdiction that has successfully managed to keep its local competition robust and create these behemoths who are now out to compete in the global economy. The question for India is whether you want to follow the path that China has adopted for its digital economy. And for all the troubles and challenges that we have of lack of Indian giants competing in the digital economy, I think the Indian story is positive. I think the stuff that's happening at the bottom of the pyramid, stuff that's happening at the micro level when it comes to technological innovations is great. I just think we need to tell our stories better.
Arun, you also became part of a recent conversation that seeks to build an Indian position around norms. India clearly is beginning to see itself as a leading power, in the words of many of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs officials. But what is the consensus, the internal consensus needed to achieve an Indian position around key questions on cyber norms? And do you think that the consensus that would be achieved would be attractive enough for others to seek to partner on?
I think it would be. I think during the first meetings of this committee, or the group, the study group that Samir had mentioned about, one of the key issues that we came up was, how do we renegotiate the agreements that currently exist so that we can so that we can tailor them to the digital economy of the 21st century. For instance, India negotiated and signed the Information Technology Agreement when it signed up to the WTO sometime in the some aspects of the WTO sometime in the late 90s. The consensus that Samir was talking about then was that we needed hardware because India had the software engineers to boot. We just needed the hardware that could service, that could provide the bedrock or the lifeblood for this software. Today, the consensus is very different. I mean, we have the software engineers, and some would say we have the technical wherewithal to build hardware, although that hardware building is, few and far between. I think the intention is there with programs like Make in India and so on and so forth. So the internal consensus has also changed. One of the things that we are now looking at is this India stack architecture. Rather than creating building blocks from the word go, creating hardware and software, creating hardware that the Chinese, for instance, will be able to provide us at a much cheaper rate. Should we not be creating application programming interfaces upon which innovations will happen? So the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Facebook is now using a unified payment interface that Indian engineers have created to process digital payments in India. So the internal consensus is
You're talking about the WhatsApp money.
That's right. So WhatsApp payments will now use the UPI, which is an interface that is developed by Indian engineers. And for a company with the bottom line, the scale and size of Facebook, to adopt this homegrown technology in a market that is supposed to be the next big frontier, this is not a political decision, this is a commercial decision. It shows that Indian technologies are scalable, it shows that Indian technologies are affordable, and while we are yet to reach this consensus, I think the ingredients are all there together.
Do you think there's a realization that these technologies are exportable as well?
Well, some of us have argued that the technology should be exported, beginning with the biometric ID program, but as you said, there is no internal consensus on whether we should have the biometric ID program in India, let alone export it to other, but the demand is, in every government conversations that, every conversation that the Indian government has had with a South Asian interlocutor, the issue of Aadhaar has come up, and folks from across the world, especially in emerging economies, are interested in how we have managed to enroll 1 billion Indians who are not known for their enthusiasm or initiative when it comes to signing up for any program onto a biometric platform. So while there are folks who rightly criticize the government for getting into something of this scale without the arguably the security architecture underlying it, I think the fact is that other countries want to know how we do it.
And of course, over the next 2 days, you will participate on a panel which discusses the digital payments ecosystem. We'll have India's head of the economic planning body, Niti Aayog, who will be joining us, and you'll have Ajay Pal Banga of MasterCard, who will be discussing this particular aspect. And of course, we have a whole conversation around the digital identity program, and certainly questions around security and some of the safety aspects associated with it. Mahima, you could hear the pain in Sean Kanuck's voice when he was describing the developments that took place last year. Twitter elected a president of the United States of America. That's what some argue. So let me put it bluntly. How long will online platforms such as Twitter hide behind the term social media when it is quite clear that they now need to take responsibilities just like any other media? They need to think about where they take advertisements from. They need to think about the tweets and the content they promote. They often need to also now start verifying the source of the content that is placed on their platform. Is it time for you to rethink and reposition and realign operations?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And thank you so much for organizing CyFy again. It's been great to see it grow through the years. Similarly, I'm just thinking back to all the various CyFys and all the discussions that we've had. One thing is quite clear. I think what we called social media, 10 years ago, 7 years ago, we meant it, I think, in a more lighter manner. It was supposed to be this fun place, It's still a fun place with satire and jokes, but social media has also become serious business. And I think that's what we're responding to now. Is social media to be categorized as mainstream media as the way it exists today? I'm not sure if that's accurate, because it's still developing and its users are still developing, and certainly there's a lot of content by citizens, not just curated, editorialized content. But having said that, yeah, I think that you have hit on a very interesting point, which is that the nature of social media and the uses of social media have changed. And I don't know if Twitter is, how central Twitter was, but certainly it was a big player, and certainly even in Indian politics, you see Twitter as a very big force. When you had the Bihar elections, for example, you had everyone from Nitish Kumar to Lalu Prasad Yadav to his son tweeting about what was happening. So just looking at the developments that have taken place in the US, I think quite unprecedented for anyone, including the company which is in the middle of the storm. And I think you're right. I mean, social media creates the news as much as it is in the news. So there are certain aspects that we've been looking at. There are conversations going on in the US. I don't want to talk more than what is already being discussed in the States, but yeah, certainly. We're looking at, we already have internal robust processes for, say, our global policies, which comes to content. And since they're global in nature, because citizens around the world are using them, they need to be global in nature, but they are being enforced with more cultural context in mind, and that's an ongoing process. That's a process that gets refined every time there is a big case that takes place, and we realize that abuse patterns have changed and they have evolved, and the company also needs to evolve with them or try and stay in front of them. Similar with political advertisement or any kind of advertisement on Twitter, the fact is that we do have ads policies, and certain geographies are not allowed to advertise on certain lines because that's illegal in that geography. For example, you won't see advertisements around weapons in India or frankly any other geography. India is a little more careful about health, prenatal, for example. Now with political advertisements, we already have policies, and we do have categories of people who we audit and review before they place an ad. But clearly, I think what's been happening is that there are actors who have used these platforms, not just Twitter. I want to speak for social media as a whole because we're discussing big themes. And those will have to be reviewed. And I think that a lot of conversation will have to take place about how these platforms are being used in the fundamental manner in which they become ingrained with the way democracy works now. And yes, so I think it's...
Mahima, the other aspect that I think requires conversation, and hopefully we will see that over a few panels at this particular version of CyFy, is around women participation on your platforms. And certainly in Africa and India, it is an issue. I can't speak for Europe and the US, but even yesterday, my colleague Beata from Botswana had mentioned, had used the term cyber bullying and harassment quite a few times in a presentation to us during the pre-conference dinner. And 5 years ago, you and I were discussing this as well when we were designing the conference. So do you think your platform is safer today for women? And do you think women are more prone and more likely to participate in political conversations, economic conversations than they were 5 years ago?
So this is a question that I personally feel very involved with. One of the things, I read this somewhere recently, which said that if you are looking at a platform and are they taking the issue of abuse seriously, you got to measure a couple of things that they are doing. Firstly, is it a company priority? Is it genuinely one of the top 3 or 4 company priorities, and certainly with respect to social media? And the person overlooking this, is it a senior person or has it been relegated to a junior person? And I think from a Twitter perspective particularly, I can say yes to both. It has been a big priority. We're all aware that Twitter, as it's been constructed, engineered and designed, is an open platform. They're not private channels, not private pages. The design of the platform is that you can tweet something in India right now, somebody in the US can like the tweet, somebody in Africa can retweet it, somebody in Europe can reply to it. That is the design of Twitter, but that open virality of Twitter has, of course, led to all these issues. Now, there are a couple of things that we've done. One is, I think, very seriously looked at, abuse patterns, what causes abuse, and looked at a couple of things. One is, like I mentioned earlier, as a platform, you have to look at your policies. You have to see the time in which you came up with these policies and do they stand today, considering the uses has changed. The second is you have to look at the tools. At the end of the day, maybe block and mute was not enough for people. Maybe you needed to introduce a lot more tools. And the third is that from your own point of view, what technology can you leverage in the platform to catch some of these bad actors before they can actually, or before they can do some damage in terms of spam, etc. Or, of course, if they try and come back on the platform, should they be bumped off the platform? So those are sort of, I think, high-level interventions that you can make. The other, I think, is it's tougher, which is content based on what the experience of women on the platform is. I've had the unfortunate luck of also being trolled sometimes myself, which I feel for somebody working at Twitter is a good thing to go through because you really are able to empathize. And that has to change. If any of you have gone through an experience like this, it is a very overwhelming experience to have so many notifications at the same time of people talking at you and talking about you. And I think that we can as a platform do better to actually elevate that situation. Having said that, when you speak to people, because content is so contextualized, a lot of people are not in favor of the platform completely sanitizing the experience for them. They want to know what's out there, but the way they want to experience it needs to be a little easier and better. So these are conversations we are constantly having, and hopefully we will be able to
And how do you manage content online is going to be one of the themes that is going to be running across many of our discussions over the next 2 days. Mr. Joshi, so Mahima alluded to the internet being a happy space, social media being a happy space. Is it actually time to drop the romantic notion of the internet being a happy space and to acknowledge that now we are dealing with a medium that is polarizing, and it is often designed to be polarizing with shrill opinions? Is digitalism the end of liberalism? Are we looking at a very different world since we introduced the digital to it?
That's too many questions to fit into 5 minutes, but let me try. First of all, my short answer is that, if the world were indeed one big happy place, the internet also would be one big happy place. Okay. The internet only reflects and mirrors the world. It does not, it is not the world. So no, that is the first answer. And in blaming the social media, in blaming the internet for many of our woes, we are typically, I think, projecting and transferring much of the ills that are ours, much of the blame which falls upon ourselves, onto the medium. And it is one thing to shoot the messenger, it is another thing to crucify the medium. So my whole point is that as far as fake news is concerned, fake news is not a new phenomenon. The rumor is as old as social aggregation. When the caveman sat around the fire to warm his hands, rumor began at that time. And it has had political uses, it has had strategic uses right through history. I mean, if you remember in 1944, Robert Knapp, analyzing the history of rumor, came out with a very, very succinct statement about what is it that rumor does. Rumor actually expresses and gratifies deep-seated emotional needs of a community. That is what it does. And if rumor becomes viral, it is only because it is expressing, at least metaphorically, some deeper perceptual truth about how communities view themselves and about how they view the world around them. So there is something when you talk about liberalism, somewhere liberalism seems to be going astray in this whole debate when we talk about this. Today, the polarization in society which you talk about manifests itself in bursts on social media, various outbursts which occur on social media. Maybe in another time, in another place, it will lead to the Crusades, or in another time, another place, to Noakhali, or something even more disastrous. So Twitter can be used, as well. I bat for Mahima there. Twitter can be used as well as for composing hate speech or for composing a haiku. The choice is yours. Make society scared, make societies afraid, and they will turn upon themselves. And that is what is happening. And that is the root of polarization. It is not the internet. It is not the social media. So the answers to that go far deeper. So digitalism, to answer about liberalism in brief, digitalism is not the end of liberalism. Liberalism, if it dies, will die because it has today turned upon itself. And that is a problem with liberalism. So, it's a different debate as to what is happening in the liberal world. So let us not mix up these two very, very different things. I would really say that, at least for liberals, remember that if we are to become the enemy we fight, then at the end of the war, when the crown is ultimately assigned to the victor, it is very dubious who has won this battle. So that is a lesson we must always remember. So it is not the medium whose structure is binary. It is something else which is binary. It is something else in society which has become binary. It is that which needs to be addressed.
Ambassador Reddy, you were part of the Build Commission. Now you are one of the chairs of the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace. Do you think these commissions respond to a need? They have a purpose? They are likely to be effective in stitching together solutions when the other traditional formats seem to be floundering and faltering? And since you have experience in both the track one processes and now these multi-stakeholder processes, how would you rate their importance in trying to stitch together some format of governance of this fast evolving medium?
Thank you, Samir. As you rightly say, I was on commissioner on the Global Commission on Internet Governance, and those of you who are here for CyFy last year will remember that we launched the report of that Global Commission here. I have a copy with me to refresh your memory. And, that was set up essentially with the cooperation between two think tanks, CG Canada and Chatham House in the UK. And the purpose was to inform concrete political recommendations for the future of internet governance by creating a framework both for coordination among advanced industrial democracies and addressing other states who had some reservations about the multi-stakeholder model. It was essentially to promote access, inclusivity, trust, safety. It was launched in June 2000, the report was launched in June 2016. So the exercise took about 2.5 years. I think the important results for me were, firstly, it was a multi-stakeholder, diverse group. You had people like me who'd been in government. You had technical organization heads. You had civil society representatives. There was a reasonable geographical diversity. You had people from the industry. And, this to me was important, that we were talking across the board. This was not a group of governments talking to each other. The second possibility is that when you do come out with your recommendations and results, you do have an opportunity to influence policymakers in different countries. And also, it is a fact that even the governmental negotiating bodies, whether in the UN or bilateral, those who are looking at bilateral agreements, do look at these recommendations. But I think the question is how you market your report and your recommendations, what kind of networking you do. And finally, since we are not laboring under a geopolitical compulsion of defending our national positions, while we certainly may have certain value judgments in these commissions, I don't think the same sort of constraints would apply as apply in a formal negotiating process. I think, for instance, I want to give you a very concrete example of how I think that commission report influenced policymakers in India. If you remember, Samir, Arvind Gupta, who was then the deputy NSA, my successor, actually quoted from the core elements of a social compact for a digital society, which was part of our report. And it said that there must be a mutual understanding between citizens and their state, that the state takes responsibility to keep its citizens safe and secure under the law, while in turn citizens agree to empower the authorities to carry out that mission under a clear, accessible legal framework that includes sufficient safeguards and checks and balances against access. The current Global Commission, of which I'm the co-chair, the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace, which was set up in early 2017, launched at the Munich Security Conference, is chaired by Marina Kaljurand from Estonia and co-chaired by Michael Chertoff from the US and myself. 27 members, again, fairly representative of various regions, has government, industry, technology organizations, civil society. And their mission is, or our mission rather, is to develop proposals for norms and policies to enhance international security, stability, and guide responsible state and non-state behavior. Also to support information exchange, capacity building, and advocacy. Now, I just have one comment. While I think both of these commissions are hugely useful, and I'm very honored to be part of both, I've learned a lot about group negotiation being quite a different process from bilateral negotiations. I think the real issue is how, I think I'm going to anticipate one of your questions, which I know you're going to ask me, Samir, which is, are governance structures responding to the need for diversity? I think this is as true of commissions as it is of governments. Is there sufficient representation of gender? The second commission, yes, because I think there's a little more diversity at the top, though even the first commission had a certain number of women in it. So I think there's importance given to the idea of gender diversity, but we still have a long way to go where, if you have an equal number of men and women, which would be the final aim, or close to equal. Nationalities, race, political beliefs, all these make for diversity, right? And again, while there's been a very conscious effort to bring in as many regions, as many countries, as many continents, and people of different backgrounds as possible, it does become complicated when, the problem is that you need mutual respect for different systems. You need non-judgmental attitudes to negotiate norms which are acceptable to all. We need to move away to a certain extent from an emphasis solely on Western democratic values as an absolute good. For instance, the four think tanks which really spearheaded and very effectively these two commissions are from Canada, UK, US, and The Hague. My question is, where are China and India? Why are we not thought leaders? Why are we not putting forward global commissions of a multi-stakeholder? We do have conferences like this. There are things like Net Mundial. There are things like, IGF and so on. But that's where, I think I can pose a question on how we make these commissions and these governance structures more active. And here I'd like to say something. I think part of the fault lies with us. And when I say us, I mean, say, India or any of the other countries I mentioned, because we are not producing adequate thought leaders. We are not, our voice is not heard enough on the international stage. And I must commend ORF, who's doing a great effort to make sure that our voice is heard and that these forums become really international and appealing to a wider audience.
Great. So the clock tells me time's up, but I'm going to use the prerogative of being the chair of the conference and use 5 more minutes of the conference time. And I'm going to ask you each to comment on one idea that may have struck you as the others were speaking before we close this particular session. So Sean, let me start with you again. One idea that struck you while you were hearing the others speak.
I've heard a few people reference the uncertainty of the future and that things can have the positive and the negative impacts in our technological change. And I think if we're going to avoid instability and uncertainty, we have to communicate collectively to solve some of these issues. So in the spirit of a conference like this, I invite and challenge all of you to meet at least one person from another country, another generation, or another profession than your own, and share your concerns and desires, because unless we keep engaging our thoughts with one another, we're not going to make sure we stay the optimistic course and don't fall prey to some of the instability possibilities.
And at last count, there are 40-odd countries in the room and 3-odd generations. So you have plenty to choose from. Arun.
I thought what struck me was Mahima's comment about how Twitter, for example, as an example of the social media platforms, is tailoring its ad to respect the laws or the social mores or political mores of a certain country. And she used the example of gun advertisements, which is, of course, a black and white issue in India, but perhaps in another. 5 years ago, I think for a Silicon Valley company to say that we will respect the laws of any country, including those of the United States, is, unimaginable. And I think it generates a certain degree of suspicion from the perspective of governments, but it is deeply rooted in a belief in the value that technology that comes out of the West Coast of the United States offers solutions to the rest of the world. So it's frankly heartening, although I know Mahima speaks our language, but I think what she says is true for the platforms as a whole.
No, but the fact that WhatsApp money is using the UPI interface is perhaps also a step in that direction. Mr. Joshi.
What struck me really was a composition, of this entire panel here and the crowd gathered in this room, and the fact that, with CyFy we are trying to do, how we began this whole exercise, and then we converted this into a technology conference. The whole idea is that, yes, we are in an age where there is an explosion of knowledge taking place. And in the future, we are talking of even, an exponential leaps in knowledge occurring through these very vast collaborative networks that we build with the people like we have assembled in this room. So this is what we want to take forward in the entire CyFy exercise.
Madam Reddy.
I think I want to talk about, very briefly about the relationship between regulation and technology. I think we all recognize that technology is always going to be leaps ahead of the regulatory mechanisms. But I think there has to be at least awareness of the fact that we need regulatory mechanisms. I asked my brother, who's a computer scientist, I said, do you think there should be regulation? He said, yes, because we scientists are crazy. If you let us, we're just going to run with every crazy technology, not think about the effects. So it's something interesting to think about are the technology buffs going to accept regulation? Are the regulatory authorities going to understand that they cannot really regulate properly if they don't involve the technology community in taking these decisions? So I think that's a thought to think about.
So thank you very much. The main purpose of bringing these... Mahima, sorry.
She has
You're going to tweet about it? Okay. Sorry. Okay. That's a temple.
Yeah, horrible, Samir. To think that I had to get him to add more women to this conference. Okay, so just a quick point to what you said. I read some great articles about why Silicon Valley needs people with liberal art degrees, and I think you've... just the thought that Sean said, he said that Ravi, is technology making security and the security forces safer, but are civilians more at risk? I don't think that's exactly what you said, but that was the... and I thought that was really interesting. I have very limited knowledge on the subject, but I was at an armed forces and social media conference recently where the armed forces themselves, outside of all the other investigation and cyber wars and infiltration that's going on, were actually trying to deal with how they themselves should be using social media. And it was a very, very interesting discussion, so I'd love to hear more about it.